Um, if I ask you when the Syrian civil war started, you would say, where's my watch? That's what you would say, because I only got 5 minutes. This is a 45-minute lecture, so you're going to get the fast version.
The highlights.
The highlights, yeah. You would say 2014. I would suggest to you that the Syrian civil war started in 1916. That was when the French and the British decided secretly to divide up the Middle East, as we call it, and to create states designed to serve their own interests, not certainly to serve the interests of local people. You know the Versailles Treaty, which had to do with, after the First World War, had to do with Germany and other issues. The Versailles Treaty had two secret clauses in it. Number one, there shall be a second World War to correct the mistakes of the ending of the First World War. And secret clause number two, there shall be an Adolf Hitler, because you cannot abuse a country the way the Europeans abused Germany and not expect a pathological reaction. So those were there. Someone who read these secret agreements, the agreements on the Middle East, once they were released, issued a statement that this is not a war to end all wars, this is a peace to end all peace, which is what I think is exactly the case. Because what the French and British did was divide up this region. There were no countries there. This was all the Turkish provinces, Ottoman provinces, and there was no countries. They decided to create little countries designed to their own making, to manipulate the borders, to make them easier to control, and to install ethnic minority regimes, because minorities, you can always control them because they're afraid of everyone else. So this is what they did. They set up a series of countries that had never existed. Now, you're sitting here and you're thinking, you know, if you go back 1,000 years ago, you're going to find something in Baghdad. If you go back 2,000 years ago, you're going to find something in Baghdad. If you go back 1,000 years, you're going to find something in Damascus. All that's true. That's not the countries they created. They created the countries they wanted to create. And they played around and tried to control those countries. So let's look at a country like Lebanon. What they did was decide, they drew a line. Everything north goes to France, everything south goes to the British, and over in the east, you've got Baghdad, that also goes to the British. So look at Lebanon. In 1860, there was some big problems in Lebanon. So what the Turks did, they said, let's just create a little zone north of Beirut. That was where there was a lot of Christian population, among others, some Sunnis as well. They said, let's just create a zone there and allow that to be a self-governing, like an autonomous province. They can kind of look after themselves within the greater empire. If the French had come along and said, you know, they've been doing this now for so many years, since 1860, maybe what we should do is just keep that in place. So when we create these new states, they'll call them mandates, right? And when we create a mandate, we'll just take that and turn that into a mandate. That would sort of been logical based on history, but that's not what they wanted to do. The French wanted to control this. So they were given this whole area, which today is Syria and Lebanon. They decided to split Lebanon off from Syria. Instead of just taking that area north of Beirut and making a mandate, they decided to push the border of Lebanon to the east, including the Bekaa Valley, which is more logically a part of Syria than it is of Lebanon, pushing the border south so that they would capture most of the main ports. Now, what do you have? Now, Syria is landlocked, basically, with one little exception, north of Lebanon. You now have, and they installed Christians in power in Lebanon, in a place where Muslims were 48% of the population. Does this sound like an unstable situation? Of course it is. They've created a catastrophe. And then what you have is not a Syria. If you had left those as one big mandate, you would have had a strong, secure Syrian state. That would have been an impressive state. And that's not what they did. They weakened Syria. They installed minority rulers in there. You got a mess. To the south, In Palestine, they brought in Europeans, East European Jews, installed a minority regime there, split Palestine in two parts, the Jewish part, Israel, the Palestinian part, Palestine, which never came into existence. And now you've got an eternal civil war between the Israelis and Palestinians. That is, as far as I can tell, it's never going to end. And then what did they do? Out to the east, I'll tell you, get a map. I just wish I had a map here. If you look at Jordan, Jordan is about 20 miles by 40 or 50 miles. That's where all the people live. Everything out of that's desert. So, but if you look at Jordan, out to the east, there's this big, long strip of land that goes out and connects to Iraq. And you say, what in the world is that? You'll notice something about that. It's a straight line. Okay, I'm going to tell you something. God hates straight lines. Whenever you see a straight line, you know God was not in the room when that map was drawn. That map was not drawn. They didn't ask the local people, what do you want? That map was drawn in Britain, and they did it the way they wanted it. And then you had all sorts of complications because Iraq is a very complex society. Up in the north, you've got Kurds. At one point, they said, let's have a Kurdish state. There's actually a map. There's going to be a Kurdish state. And then they brought in some nice rulers from Saudi Arabia and put them in charge, and they said, okay, we can control this. So they installed a regime to their liking. Let me read you a couple of things. A couple of quotes. Theodor Herzl is the founder of the Zionist movement. In 1896, he wrote a book called Der Judenstaat, the Jewish state, and he called for the creation of a Jewish state. And the next year, he was really a genius. And he organized people. He said, look, anybody can make an argument. Let's start talking about organization. But in that article, pamphlet that he wrote, he said, once a Jewish state is created, we will be loyal to whoever created us because you're going to have to keep us afloat. That's what he said. You will have a loyal ally. Then here is what Osama bin Laden said when he talked about Osama bin Laden, his declaration of war in the United States. 1996, he referred to 80 years of chaos. So I'm going to have my students read this in a couple weeks. I'm going to say, okay, 80 years of chaos. What's he talking about in 1996? What's he talking about? He's talking about Sykes-Picot. That has created chaos. When he later said in a different document, you cannot straighten the shadow if the rod is crooked. Chaos is written into the DNA of these countries. And ISIS, when they took power in northern Iraq and eastern Syria, you know what they did. Some of you will remember. There is a berm. I've never been to this place, but it's kind of a desert area. And there's a berm, just a pile of dirt, which indicates where the border is. And the very first thing they did was get a bunch of young guys out there with shovels, and they dug away that berm. And they said, the Sykes-Picot Treaty has now been reversed. Iraq and Syria are fake countries, and they no longer exist. Isn't that interesting? I once interviewed my time is up.
Your time is gone, but.
Thank you. I'll sit down then. I'll tell about my
Pick it up from there.
I'll tell about my Hamas friend later.